who is editor at the Athens Banner-Herald, and then Rana Cash, who is editor at the Savannah Morning News. Thank you guys so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Glad to be here.
Yeah, and can you guys talk to me about how your job has changed since the pandemic began, or began in March? How's it changed?
Who wants to start?
Dale, you go ahead.
For me, completely, my life's been turned upside down. Since March, I've worked from home. We don't go back to the building. The photographer works out of his home. We drive in separate cars when we show up at a story event. Of course, the masks and social distancing is a part of every interview we do. But, after 4 decades in the business, I'm now working like a millennial. So it's quite a change for me.
Rana, what about you?
Yeah, it's been a big change for me. At the start of the pandemic, I didn't even live in Savannah, Georgia. So that's one thing. I was in Louisville, Kentucky, and I came here this summer. And just from an editor standpoint, getting to know the staff, not being able to have that, that camaraderie in the newsroom, and now beginning to have one-on-one sessions with them, and also giving them a comfort level in going out and reporting when you're around people who may be ill, and where do you find that comfort level? So it's been dramatically different since March. Everything about our lives has been different.
Yeah, I'm similar to Rana in that at the beginning of the pandemic, I lived in Kentucky. So we both came here from Kentucky. I took over as editor in Athens 10 days before we went under shelter in place. So pretty much my entire existence at the Banner-Herald has been during the pandemic. And so I don't really know another way at this point. So yeah, I don't know that there is how has it changed. That's the only thing I know right now. But it's been, I think I just echo what they've both said. Just we're working from home and trying to navigate that every day.
Yeah. Talking about politics, what do you think the biggest challenge is going to be for journalists going into the 2020 election, given the pandemic?
I'll start. Yeah. I think that it's so hard to separate the pandemic from so many other issues that are happening right now. You have what's going on with the post office, and it's all sort of intertwined and so intermixed. But obviously, the biggest thing is that we're all still navigating the work from home life. Journalists are very married to the idea of the election night in the newsroom and pizza together. There's this big camaraderie that comes together, and I think trying to figure out how to cover an election that we likely won't know results from for days, if not weeks, afterward. And how do we still cover that effectively without having that sort of nuclear newsroom night that we're all so used to? I think that's going to be a big adjustment for a lot of places.
I'm already trying to figure out how do I get these pizzas delivered to the reporters at their homes, putting that in a little bit of a fund to the side, because we will miss that. That's one of the highlights for a newsroom is election night. And I also think the challenge is from a reporter standpoint is how do you make sure that you're holding election officials accountable, making sure that they're doing their job, but at the same time understanding the immense pressure that they are under because of the pandemic, because of in Georgia, new machines, training new poll workers, all of the things that we saw in the primary only multiplied to a greater degree. So I think that will be a challenge for the reporters, for the journalists to do both, to be firm and at the same time trying to understand the position that election officials are going to be in this time around.
Yeah, I would echo both of what they both said. That completely agree about losing that camaraderie, and at the same time, we have found in not only election stories but all the stories we're covering with government, especially in the beginning. It's gotten better lately. But the officials, the state officials, the city officials, the federal officials were hard to find. They were deep deep somewhere. And a lot of them were working from home. And what was an easy or doable communication in the past became extremely difficult, not with just elections, but every department. I do think that has gotten better. I also think the challenge, especially when we get to election night, is we're going to be sending crews out into very large crowds. I was in Fulton County polling place the day of the June election when the line stretched all the way around Grady High School. It was crazy, but a lot of people, very little social distancing, very little mask wearing. Well, I'd say about 60-40 mask wearing. And you're sending your crews into situations of large crowds. I think there's going to be large crowds, maybe not as big as there used to be, but there should be crowds at each one of these election headquarters. And what's their personal safety going to be like, and how are they going to handle that? And I know each news organization is going to have to deal with that as well.
Those are thoughts that have been on my mind even tonight, because Donald Trump Jr. is in town in Savannah tonight for a campaign rally, and we have a photographer and a reporter there. And yeah, I do have concerns about, their safety and the large crowds and how we will manage that situation. And that'll just continue and even ramp up between now and November.
Yeah. With most of us still working from home, how are we going to gauge, voters, what their thoughts are, and also what are the big stories, working from home? I feel like for me, I've been depending a lot on social media and monitoring that more than I ever have because of the situation we're in. Mm-hmm. Would you guys agree?
Yeah. Absolutely. I think that so much reporting comes from social media now. I think that even pre-pandemic, we relied on social media and Google Trends and so many tools to tell us what people were talking about and kind of where the story was at the moment. And I think that right now, we're all stuck at home. It's not just journalists, it's everyone. And so people, to communicate their opinions and communicate what is bothering them, they're using social media. And so I think we're so reliant on that right now. And you do lose some of that boots on the ground reporting. And I think it's still important to get out as much as you can and as safely as you can. But there's a really great well of knowledge and well of information out there on social media. You just have to be a little more careful with a lot of it.
Yeah. We've started just here this week. We will be reaching out to our readers to ask them specifically, what are the issues that you're most interested in, and what are the issues that are going to drive you to the polls, as opposed to making assumptions about what those are, or even simply going by social media and tweets and things like that. There's validity to those, of course, but we will do all that we can to try to speak directly to readers and hear from them and allow them to comment and share with us in a more closed, private type of environment what it is that's motivating them this year.
I'm in the I team, so we have a little bit of a different take on all this. But as we watched all this election craziness unfolding, we wanted to jump into it. We were just trying to find where's the right vehicle. And I would say tell this to other reporters and young reporters especially. This is a time to be very flexible and pick your battles, if you will, because we had a good situation here in Fulton County. Not good for Fulton County, good for reporters, that there was a lot of controversy. The elections board stepped in. They wanted an investigation by the state on how things were handled, people not getting their absentee ballots. And we were really intrigued by the absentee ballot issue, because obviously that's huge in this election. And we got a tip on a story down in Long County, which I can tell you is about a 4.5-hour drive. I had to look it up on the map, I hate to say. 4.5-hour drive from Atlanta, and it was sort of breaking, and it was an election challenge from a local probate court judge. But the issues to us were universal in the sense of Georgia and maybe the whole nation. Some of the issues were double voting, absentee ballots, what we found in the weeks since this story first aired, mass confusion by people in voting absentee, which I was actually surprised about. I voted absentee myself. I thought it was fairly simple, but a lot of people don't. A lot of people are finding the ballots confusing and aren't signing them, or the wrong person's helping them, or the wrong person's
Hey,
asking
guys.
for their advice.
Hey, also
And
my. Hey,
ah,
hey, you look at my.
is this?
Stop me. Stop. I'm gonna.
Good job, Charlotte.
Was
Pretty
that
good, Charlotte.
Charlotte? Was
Proceed.
that,
Apologies. Yes.
oh, was that a troll or what was that?
Yeah, it sounded like it. So
Oh,
it's been handled. Apologies. Please continue.
sorry about that, Dale.
Sure. But so this is a case in a small county far away from Metro Atlanta, but it resonates across the state to me. And we followed up on that case, followed up on the hearings, because again, those were the same issues that everyone was facing. And not long after we did the story, Secretary of State, Mr. Raffensperger, came out with the announcement that there was 1,000 double voters, people who voted absentee and then walked into the polls and voted, and he vowed to prosecute. And that came because we were asking his office and asking others, how many are these double voters? How many accounting of this do you have in each county in the state of Georgia? And we now have a total. And 1,000 people sounds like a lot in a sense. It's a minuscule number in the grand scheme of over 1 million votes taking place in the June election. But it's still interesting. It's interesting to us that how could that even happen? And I think we found the answer, and we're all going to be seeing this election day, is human error. We have new machines, we have automation, but a lot of it is just poll workers, and a lot of them are volunteers. And when you add human error with confusion on the voters' part, we're all going to see a lot of problems, I'm afraid, on November.
And with the pandemic, I know a lot of voters are relying on absentee ballots and are voting by mail. Some of the false info surrounding the election, including about mail-in ballots and absentee ballots, is coming, from the president and other politicians. How can we address it? And then also, how can we educate voters on the system?
You know what, I'll jump in on that. I think that's so important because sometimes we as journalists tend to write for ourselves, for our publications and this kind of thing. And I think this is more than at any time, we have to turn the mirror to our readers and provide for them what they need and answer the questions that they have. It's sort of that utility journalism, the things that sometimes you don't find the time to do because you are doing the investigations, you are trying to do your deeper dives and your personality profiles and things like that. And what can get lost in that is that just basic utility things, providing content that readers need, helping to inform them about what the poll, how do you fill out this absentee ballot? What can you expect? What does it look like? When is the deadline? Every question that can come up, and answer it in as many different ways and as many different times as it takes, both in print and online. It's not just a digital thing. It's not just a print thing. There are a lot of people who are confused by this process, as Dale just pointed out. If you receive something in your mailbox from the Donald Trump campaign or Joe Biden campaign, and it says, go to joebiden.com or whatever and get your absentee ballot. Do you trust that? Is it trustworthy? What's real and what's not. And it's up to us to kind of help people filter through all of that confusion.
Yeah, I think approaching things with a real service mind, as Rana said, is really important right now. And maybe flushing some of the ideas that we've had where we do things because we've always done them, or because we know that one person likes them, or we've had maybe a little bit of positive feedback in the past. I think that we all have such an ability to know what people are wanting to hear and what they're asking now, and that we can't ignore all of this information that we're getting. And so we should really approach these sort of things with a real service mind, and be that kind of truth teller in these moments, because there is a lot of misinformation. And I think that we can serve as a really great, we can almost function as like almost as a nonprofit, although we all are for-profit businesses. We should serve as sort of that, have that kind of nonprofit mentality in these moments.
I'm so glad to hear that from you guys, because that's exactly what we're doing. So I think maybe a lot of us in journalism are on the same page. We know what is ahead of us. We know what's ahead of for the voters. We're planning, our Claire Sims, reporter for us, is going to be putting together a multi-part package leading into the election where, and I haven't been totally involved in the planning, but as I understand it, that pretty much all the problems that various reporters are seeing out in the field or in their stories, passing them all along to a central location, and they're going to be kind of parceled out, and Claire's going to take these different problems and address them. And it's almost an educational, paint by numbers course, if you will, for our viewers to help them through these very difficult times. And you mentioned President Trump's comments. I have to tell you, when we were in Long County, my producer, Mindy Larkham, and photographer, Chris Rosenthal, interviewed a gentleman who admitted to voting twice on camera. In fact, he was, I think, rather surprised when they told him at the end of the interview that it's a felony to do so.
Wow.
But blatantly said he did it to test the system. And he did not reference the president's remarks directly, but I wondered if that had anything to do with why he did what he did. And he just walked us through it. He had voted absentee, came in with his wife. They handed him a ballot, and he went, what's going to happen if I fill this out? And he took himself through the steps and voted a second time, and walked out of the voting place and walked over to the sheriff's department, small community. He knew the sheriff and told him what he had done. But there is confusion out there. We have a president that has told people, vote twice. You can't do that. And I felt, watching the Secretary of State, Mr. Raffensperger, I wondered if that was part of the reason he was out in public saying what he was saying, that he was clearly saying, okay, 1,000 people have double voted in the last election. Like I said, that's 1,000 out of over 1 million votes. Although I will tell you, in a small community, those votes can be the difference. The challenge in Long County was 9 votes. I covered another election challenge up in Habersham. It was a 2-vote differential. So it can make a big difference in a small community, and that is not to be taken lightly. But I think Mr. Raffensperger wanted people in the state of Georgia to hear the words felony and illegal and will prosecute. And I think it's a strong message, and a message that everyone should hear. I don't know that there's that much, I don't even know if I'd call it fraud. Right now, from everything we've seen, I would call it more confusion than fraud.
Out of curiosity, that source that you were talking about in Long County, did he go on the record and, did you guys run the story?
Yeah, we did. The source ultimately was made public, in a sense, I guess you would say. And it was a filed election challenge in court. So it was an open case ultimately. We just had a beat on it because it was so far out of the ADI here that there wasn't a lot of attention. The local press down there in Long County covered it. And actually I thought did a good job. But there weren't a lot of people in Metro Atlanta.
Yeah. Also, I know a big topic in Georgia has been and seems to still be voter purges and alleged voting suppression. An estimated 1.4 million voter registrations were canceled in Georgia between 2012 and 2018. That's according to a PBS report. How can we be, the watchdog over this in 2020? And then with this, how can we particularly bring light to minority voices on this topic?
I think a lot of people still, despite that data that you have there, don't believe it. Again, we talk about misinformation and testing, what's true and what's not. And there are a lot of people who say if you say voter suppression so many times, eventually the message, sort of peters out. But I think that it's important to continue to keep a light on that. It is an important topic, and it is happening even in subtle ways, whether it's, the polls being lack of transportation to the polls, or there not being enough of polling locations, or the long lines in certain neighborhoods, particularly neighborhoods with people of color, where the districts where they vote. There are many factors that, the identifications, how easy are they to get? People who are in jails, but are not convicted, but are in jails and not able to pay their bond to get out, but they're still eligible to vote. How do you get ballots to them? So the sort of the evidence of this voter suppression, and some may think that word is too strong, but the hurdles are significant. And, I think we have to not just we have to talk to the people who are being affected by it, and take ourselves out of the way, take our assumptions out of the way, our personal beliefs, our political beliefs, whatever they may be, and test our own assumptions. Go and speak to people, and not just to officials, but get out into the communities and ask them, what are you seeing? What are you encountering? Is it difficult for you? Is it easy for you? What's preventing you from voting? And those are, communities largely with people of color. And if that means going out of your way to get to these communities, then so be it. A little bit longer drive, so be it. But we can't turn away from that topic, especially in a year like this.
I would say that from a smaller newsroom perspective, because I think that sometimes if you're a smaller newsroom, and there are a lot of them in the state, that hearing the term watchdog or I-team or whatever sounds very, very daunting, and it sounds like something you can't do. And I think this is something where the power of journalism as a whole in this state is so important, and not just one newsroom. I think that everyone can do their part and go into these communities and report what we're seeing and what we're hearing from individuals. But when you come together as the entity of journalism in the state, that's when it becomes really powerful, because there's no way that a small newsroom could take on that task on their own. They just couldn't. It's not feasible. And I think this is where journalists are naturally competitive, and I think this is actually where the competitive spirit would even be good, because we're all going to be fighting for the truth kind of against each other, but for each other at the same time. And I think that that's where the power of all of our journalists is so important around something like this, because we can't all be in major markets, and we can't all be big newsrooms, but we can all contribute to telling the truth.
I think the voter suppression that you talked about initially, I will tell you that is a topic I have not covered personally. I've only watched it from the sidelines, from a distance. I'm sorry, I'm getting printed messages on my screen. And I found it daunting and confusing at times in talking to people who were involved in it. That was it suppression, or is it housekeeping, as the Secretary of State, at one time Brian Kemp, and then Mr. Raffensperger, both saying that they've got to clean up the rolls, that people have not contacted us, we're not hearing from them, we haven't heard from them in years. And some of that has a legitimacy sound to me. And in other parts, I've talked to people, I said, well, what's it matter if their names are on the rolls? How does that ultimately impact you guys when you get down to election day? And the answer is they claim it makes it open for fraud. And I don't know, it's a very interesting, it's a great question. And it's an interesting topic to me. Since I haven't done any investigation of it personally, I haven't formed a consensus in my own mind of what is the right thing to do. Because I will tell you what worries me is, for example, in this recent 2 stories that we did of election challenges, where we got a hold of voting rolls and literally we're calling voter by voter by voter to find out, why did you double vote, or why did you vote if you lived outside the jurisdiction where you voted. And I could say an overwhelming trend, and the people that we were calling were, and I have to use this term loosely, elderly. I would say many of them in their 70s and up. And that's what concerns me with the whole purging of voting rolls is, yeah, there's people that maybe have not been in touch, maybe they haven't voted recently, but that doesn't mean they're not necessarily active voters. Maybe for some reason they can't get to the polls, or maybe for some reason, as many of us have felt, they don't like candidates on either side. So why am I voting? But I worry about that. And I do worry about the disenfranchised people that maybe could be knocked off a roll through no fault of their own. And they're given opportunities. The Secretary of State gives them opportunities to get back in touch with the state. But, you know, I've struggled at times trying to find my voting page on the Secretary of State internet page, you know, or finding mine and then finding my wife's, and her information is different from mine. And we both had asked for absentee ballots at the same time. So it can be daunting and it can be complicated out there. And there are a lot of people that can't handle that. And I don't want to see those people lost in the shuffle. And I hope they're not.
Also, you know, what would you guys say is the biggest election story in your community, and what's the important issues to your audience right now?
Hands down, biggest election story is absentee voting in my mind.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know that you can really top that. I mean, that's nationally just going to be something we're all facing. I'm trying to think if there's one in Athens. Granted, do you have something you want to?
No, I mean, there's, you know, there are other issues, obviously, you know, the pandemic and healthcare and the economy. Really it all kind of circles around the Trump, the national presidency, the national election, I think, and where people stand on some of those issues. But at the end of the day, the biggest issue, the biggest thing we're going to be talking about on election night and leading up to it and in the weeks after will be balloting, the absentee ballots, mail-in voting, et cetera. Because I don't think we're going to have an outcome for quite some time afterwards.
Yeah, and also, you know, counting the absentee ballots once they get all of them in, I feel like with the number that we saw in the June primary, seeing what are we going to see in November? That's going to be the real question. Also, another topic, I know we saw back in June, along with the pandemic, long lines and these new voting systems. Can each of you talk about what you saw in your markets? I know we have Caitlyn, you're from Athens, Rana, Savannah, and then Dale, Atlanta. Could you guys talk to me what you saw in your markets? And given that, do you expect to see the same problems in November? Also, my power just went out. Oh, it's back on. Great. But do you manage answering that? The storm's coming in, I guess.
Right. Dale, do you want to go first?
No, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, I would say I don't know that we had some issues with miscounted ballots, and we had a recount here. We didn't have anything that rose to a national level locally. I think we're very aware of things that were happening in other counties. You're asking me to remember something that happened in June, and I know this sounds crazy, but that feels like a lifetime ago right now, and I should have better prepared for that. But I do recall that that our audience was very aware of what was happening in other counties and the lines that were happening, and it could very much happen here. It did not. We didn't experience anything of that sort in Athens or the surrounding counties, but it was very much a talking point and something that readers were interested in when I think there were a few polling places in the metro Atlanta area, and I believe, Rana, there was a polling place or two in the Savannah area that had those issues. And so I don't know that Athens was all but empty in June. So we were a little bit different in that way.
Yeah.
We had a variety of problems. Oh, go ahead, Rana.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, we certainly had more than a few issues here in Savannah. There was an instance where there was not an outlet to plug in one of the voting machines. There was, I remember an instance where someone voted and they printed out her votes, and then when she came out to look at it, it wasn't what she had put in. There were boxes of absentee ballots that were found later after the election that had not been counted. It was just one issue after another here in Savannah, and we can only hope that they learn from that because it was probably one of the, outside of Atlanta, maybe the sort of the worst failings that we saw in the state.
I read about some of the ones that you're talking about, Rana. We had some of the similar problems here, polling places opening late, machine malfunctions. I think we had the socket problem that you had in Atlanta at one of the polling places where they couldn't plug the machine in. They also had, and everybody has to remember, June was right in the heat of the pandemic, and all of these people who had volunteered to give their time for all of us to have a safe, honest election. And many of them, again, were older because they're retired and they can volunteer. All of a sudden are faced with a pandemic or are being told by all the scientists in the country that you need to shelter at home. You don't need to be out. So a lot of our polling places here lost their staff. You know, it's a volunteer staff, but it's their staff nonetheless, or lost a good portion of it. So they were scrambling to replace, and you got to train. It's not just you sign up and, you know, say, I'll come in and you show up on election day. You got to understand how this system works and what you're supposed to do. And what do you do when somebody comes in who says, I want to vote, but I had an absentee ballot? What are the steps I've got to go through? So they lost that body of knowledge that had done a number of elections for them over the years, and they were scrambling to replace it. It comes back to what one of the supervisors said to me, and I think it's the key to all this, that they're human. And humans are going to make mistakes, and especially when you have volunteer humans, that this is not a full-time job, that they do 40 hours a week, 52 weeks out of the year. So that's going to be critical, I think, is where's the workforce going to come from? Who's the workforce going to be? Are they going to be willing to brace and face this pandemic and get out there and do all the necessary things to do when you have a situation like we did in Fulton County with crazy lines? I mean, I wanted to tip my hat to all the voters that I saw in those lines, that they were going to wait. There were some that when we were there were people telling me they'd waited 3 and 4 hours. I got to tell you, there are not many candidates I like that much that I'm going to wait 3 or 4 hours to vote for. And I thought, well, good for them that they're hanging in there and they're doing their civic duty under these horrible conditions. So I hope that we're going to be better prepared. I know a lot of the county commissioners and county commission chairmen in the various counties and mayors of the various cities have done a lot of thinking, a lot of task force and a lot of groupthink on how do we best get through this. I think we're going to be better in November. That's my gut, but I think it's going to be daunting nonetheless.
Because we'll have far more voters. I mean, whatever that line was then, it'll be 3 times that. And so that gets back to my point, Ashton, originally about holding them accountable, and at the same time having like some understanding that, you know, they're volunteers, that they're going to be overwhelmed, and how do they meet that challenge? To me, that's the biggest story of the 2020 election.
Yeah. And yeah, I don't know if anyone saw this afternoon, but we'll probably see more issues with lines in the November election, because UGA announced today that they're not doing early voting on campus. And so any students that are still here in November are going to be, are not going to have that option. And I think that's going to create a whole nother dimension of complication.
Yeah.
I hadn't heard, why did they announce that they weren't going to do early elections?
I think
early voting.
I haven't read the full press release because it was just before we got on this, but I think it was basically a safety hazard, as they didn't have any spaces they could host the early elections. Yeah.
Oh.
Basically saying it was a safety issue. Several jokes arose on Twitter about, well, why not use that football stadium you guys are so excited to use?
And that's an issue where you wouldn't necessarily immediately think to apply the word suppression, right? Because that's like very intentional. We don't want you to vote, but it does suppress the vote potentially. And so it's a matter of interpretation of that word. I think again, it's just one more barrier that will make it more difficult for young people, in this instance, first-time voters, to make it a little bit harder for them to have their voices heard.
And I
do want to mention UGA about 15 minutes ago put a statement out already kind of backing up.
I was just looking at that. I just looked at that tweet that they said that they're looking to get an approved site for the Secretary of State at the Coliseum. So we might see a walk back on that.
I was just about to tell you, Caitlyn, that your staff has a lot of work to do on this, because that just didn't make sense to me. That if you're going to hold an election in November, why can't you pull this off with the early voting?
Dale, very little makes sense in Athens right now.
I believe you there.
Well, moving on to the next question, something that became very important in 2016 was social media influence, such as in the case of widespread disinformation and manipulation in the election from foreign actors like Russia. With this context in mind, what can journalists better anticipate this year?
Perhaps more greater attempts to try and influence it. One thing we've done, Savannah Morning News and Athens, along with the Augusta Chronicle, we're all a part of the USA Today network. And USA Today does what they call a Facebook fact check. A lot of it is politics, but not all of it. It could be about any number of things, conspiracy theories and things like that. And I think as a company, we do a great job, that side of what we're doing, of every day on the Facebook page, there's a Facebook fact check about something that people are, wondering about. And I think that helps fight against a lot of that misinformation. I believe one I saw today was about whether Joe Biden took draft deferments as well, or was it just Donald Trump? And it turned, yes, it's true. He did because of asthma, and for Donald Trump, it was bone spurs. But the fact that that question was being asked, and we took the time to answer that question and not let it just kind of linger out there, but trying to find those things that sort of in the dark web, as well as those that are in the bright light, and answer those questions, hopefully will help. It probably won't curtail the misinformation, but it will help people understand and sort of disseminate, truth from fact.
Yeah, I think one thing that that we can anticipate more, and this is not necessarily a good thing that we can anticipate this, but I think that it's getting harder and harder for readers to know the difference between information on Facebook and news being shared on Facebook. And I think that we have to be a lot more transparent about how that process works. And I think that we have to really fight very hard when we put our stories on Facebook. And I know that we all are very reliant on social media to get our stories out there. But time and time again in comments, I'll see where people say, oh, this is on Facebook, why would I believe this? And I'm like, well, it is on Facebook, but it wasn't written by Facebook, or it's not just a post on Facebook. And so I think knowing that people are very aware of misinformation now and trying to help them see where good information is, I think that we're gonna have to work really hard on that.
I've been around long enough that I can remember when readers were totally confused about the difference between the opinion page and the rest of the newspaper.
That was
and
yesterday.
Didn't understand that they were two separate organizations, if you will, within an organization. and two separate jobs in a sense in providing information to the readers. I don't know how these folks figure it out today. It is so confusing because everything comes at you from the same source. I mean, if I'm reading a newspaper and I get to the opinion page, we all know that we're now reading the personal opinion of one person. But there are readers that get confused by that. And television networks can have talk show hosts with very strong opinions, bringing you news. At the same time, newscasters are doing straight newscasts coming out of that same box at you. Now you throw in social media on top of that. There's no wonder everybody's confused. And they are. I think they are. Because I see it in readers. I see it in viewers. I see it in my friends who are confused about the news and are constantly, and by the way, Rana, y'all have a great fact check. And I think the more organizations that do fact checking, the better off we're going to be now, because that's the reality that we're in now. Mm-hmm. Nobody knows what's true anymore. So they don't know who to turn to or who to trust. And one thing, Ashlyn, to your question is, I think we're a little better prepared now. And as when you talk about what USA Today is doing, and others like them, we didn't know what was going on in 2016. We'd never heard of Russians using social media to interfere with an election. It was virtually unheard of. So now at least we're somewhat educated. We know what can be done. We know it can be done from the Russians. We can know it can be done by one or either party who wants to influence the election their way. It can be by people who just want to disrupt the election for whatever reason. So you've got all this misinformation that we now know is coming at us, we as news organizations. So I think we're a little bit better prepared to handle it with things like fact checking and sourcing of the stories that we're doing, letting people know what we're doing, being more transparent ourselves in how we do our investigations or our reporting. We're trying to make it as easy as possible for us, it's viewers, for you, it's readers, to follow along and trust us. I mean, the media has lost so much trust in the general public that we have to be cognizant of that, and we have to constantly be aware and bring these folks in and let them know how we do what we do, and let them know that you can trust that we're going to do this right, that we're not perfect, we're going to make mistakes, but we're going to do it fair, we're going to be balanced, we're going to give you both sides or all three sides if there's three, so that you know that we're a source that's viable for you. But what we don't know is what's next. What's the next game that the Russians or the Chinese or whoever, I'm scared to death about our voting machines. You know, we've had long conversations about, can you hack the system? How would you do it? How would it be possible? And though we couldn't come up with any way to do it, I think we have a fairly good system. And as I said earlier, from what I've seen so far in this election cycle and the reporting we're doing, I don't see widespread fraud. I just don't. And I'm not saying there's not some fraud. I'm just saying I don't see it widespread. I don't see it on a large scale. But I don't know what's next. And sure as I'm sitting here, there's 20,000 people in a basement somewhere in another country on their computers spending 20 hours a day trying to figure out how to destroy this country and trying to figure out how to disrupt our elections. And they win by just making the people not trust the results, which we're already having discussions about in this country. Who's going to believe the results? Is one side going to acquiesce to the other? I mean, sometimes I'm kind of stunned that I'm hearing these conversations before anything's even done. But we're having them. And so if you're a voter at home and you're hearing your top public officials arguing about whether or not the results of an election are going to be valid, and we haven't even voted yet, we don't even know if what the problems are or how bad they're going to be, you're setting up all the citizens of this country for mass confusion, I think, and distrust. Distrust seems to me to just be rampant everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
I guess that's rampant.
Yeah. And I have a last question that'll be really quick. What is something we may have missed in the 2016 election that we need to focus on going into 2020 and after November? We don't have too much time to answer it, but if you guys can answer it.
I wouldn't be surprised if our answers are pretty much the same. I think what was missed in 2016 is that there was a large swath of voters who were ignored, and everyone was, or so many people, I shouldn't say everyone, so many people were surprised at the last hour that President Trump was able to win this election. But the people who sort of the quiet, quiet middle America, the sort of people who had this sort of burning rage and distrust and about what was happening in the country, we didn't really, as a national media, really didn't, in my opinion, tap into their thoughts enough. We made too many assumptions about things. And I don't think that's going to happen this time around.
I would agree with you completely. And I'm not really even sure, Ashlyn, how to answer that question. As I just said, I think in some ways we're better prepared, but we also, none of us were expecting a pandemic during an election. And that just it not only brings all the crazy medical and societal issues to the forefront, we're now having to hold a very important and a very contentious presidential election in the midst of the worst medical nightmare we've had in this country since I don't even know when. So I think that's going to be a big part of 2020 is what is the impact of this pandemic? Is it going to suppress votes? Will the absentee ballots make up for it? The mail-in ballots make up for it, or not? Or are people going to be satisfied when it's all over and all the votes are counted? I don't know, but I think the pandemic is clearly going to be a major factor in our coverage over the next few weeks.
Caitlyn, what's your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree with you. It's a really hard question to answer. And full transparency, I was fun employed during the 2016 election, so I didn't have to worry about how to cover it. So it's a little bit hard for me to answer that, but I think that obviously the big wake-up call was that kind of quiet middle America, as Rana said. I think that was obviously something we all, right after that election, grappled with, and I think that is something that no longer is ever ignored at this point. I think we're very aware of the separation among Americans and the kind of differences in opinion. So that's my kind of cop-out answer.
Well, at this time, that's all my questions, but I'm going to open it up to people in the audience, who has a question, or does anybody?
There's one question. This is Charlotte. Hi, disembodied Charlotte. There's one question from Julia in the chat, so I'll just read it aloud. I have a question whenever it be feasible to discuss this. How would you all cover absentee votes received by the end of the election night, given the possibility that those votes could indicate public sentiment, but may not explicitly decide a race?
Oh, that's a hard.
Well, that's a hard question.
Yeah, I guess I'm a little bit confused by it, but received by the end of election night, I would assume if they were received by the end of election night, they're going to be counted, and they're going to be in the final vote that we get that day. If she's talking about the votes that come in later than that, I think that's an interesting point and an interesting question of what happens. There's got to be a cutoff. When I think it's under legal review right now, but at some point, and actually I hate to say this, I'm not even sure what the federal law on this point is at this point in time, because I've been following Georgia. But there's going to be a point where the mail-in votes stop and they stop being counted. And I think what she's asking is, what's the impact of the votes that come in after that? And if they show a different leaning one way or the other than the winning candidate, what does that mean? You know what? There's going to be a lot of discussion if that's what happens. If there are a lot of votes that don't get counted, I would doubt in a presidential election it would sway the vote one way or another. But if you do see a strong trend one way or the other, and it's against the winner, It will be absolutely picked apart and analyzed and discussed and debated ad nauseum.
And perhaps taken to court.
Mhm.
The outcome of the election
And
could be challenged.
perhaps taken to court.
Yeah. And Dale or Rana, you guys may know the answer to this, but I don't know how they're going to report absentee voting since they are accepting absentee ballots for up to several days after the election. I don't know when the cutoff is exactly. So I don't know that they'll even release absentee totals until, I don't know that they'll release on the night of the election unless they have some way of knowing.
Could I
I don't-
offer?
Go ahead.
Oh, could I offer a point
I-
of clarification to my question?
Sure.
Okay,
Sure.
so the reason I was saying this is I'm in the Oconee County area, and our absentee votes actually did come in right election night, like by 9 p.m. We had, like in the case of the sheriffs, it was,
Yes.
we were able, the losing candidate, or presumably losing, conceded before the other votes were counted actually. So I guess what I meant is in terms of if the absentee votes are having a strong leaning one way or the other, you know, how do you cover, because thinking about like presidential elections, it's kind of like the same thing of, oh, this person is projected to win at this point. Do you have that cutoff point with the absentee votes, or how do you do it? Because like you said, we may not know the answer to elections for weeks after.
Personally, Julia, what I would say is you just spell out exactly like that when you're reporting. You say exactly what you know. If they do give an absentee vote total that night, you say, we get this many. We expect a considerable more to come in, and we don't know what this says so far. We have no idea what this means yet. I would be as transparent and honest with your readers as you go. And I had forgotten about that in the Oconee race, that we did get a lot of absentee ballots late in the sheriff's race. Now, I will say the conceding candidate was pretty considerably far behind. I think that he was correct in conceding when he did. I don't think that the absentee votes were going to bring him close enough to make that too much of a race in the end. But I do see your point on that. But I would just be as open and transparent as you can as we get those, because there's no reason to withhold information, but there's also no reason to analyze completely. Honestly, it's not really even information. It's just a number.
And we touched on this earlier, and I'm not sure what form the reporting might be, but and in some ways it's easier in broadcasting than print, but because it's immediate, but now print's immediate, so it's all the same. Just be open and transparent with the audience as best as possible. That there's nothing wrong with saying, we don't know. This is what we know, but we don't know this. And the readers and the viewers understand that and respect that when you don't try to blow smoke, if you will. And just let them know, these are the facts. This is what's in at this point in a time. This is what's variable. And the one thing about covering elections that is so critical, and I've told a lot of young reporters, is before you go into election night, you've got to sit down with the leaders of the campaigns for both sides and find out there, and you can do this on background generally, what's their strategy? What do they have to do? Where do they have to win? Where can they concede? How are they going to do this? And I can't tell you how invaluable that is when you go into an election. I had one years ago in which I literally, at the end of the evening, because they were projecting the winner as the incumbent in a Senate race, and they said, go home. It's over. And I said, it's not over, because I talked to the analysts for the campaign of the Republican candidate, Mac Mattingly, and they had told me that they're still in it. They think they can win it. And the next morning around 10 o'clock, Mac Mattingly held up the paper that said Talmadge won, and he was the U.S. Senator from Georgia, the first Republican in, since Reconstruction, I believe. But it was all because I had spent time with the analysts that knew the race. And if we hadn't done, there were other reporters that stayed as well. There was a small group of us that were believers because we were listening to what the experts in the campaign were saying, and more importantly, we had talked to them beforehand, and they could say to us not only that, hey, we might win this. They were pulling out maps saying, here's why we can win this. Look down here. Talmadge won this 80-20 last time. It's 60-40 now. You know, things, that kind of detail. Do your homework before you go into the election. Know what the campaigns know and what they're expecting to happen, so that as it's unfolding real time, you have a better understanding of what you're seeing, and be very careful with making any projections.
Charlotte, do we have any other questions, or do we have time for any other questions?
Yeah, we have time. Stell just plopped a question in there. She said that she came in late, so we may have already discussed this, but Trump has actually encouraged people to challenge the results of the election if he doesn't win. Can you imagine what this might look like in your community? Do you think people would challenge the results in some way aside from lawsuits?
I'll be surprised if they don't challenge
Yeah.
the election.
We just had a challenge here. We just had a challenge here in a race, and it didn't change the outcome. The difference was the original vote was won by 20, and then after a hand recount, it was by 19. So it was very, very slim. Didn't make much of a difference at all. But I think that's why this election is going to drag out for quite some time on the local level and the state level and the national level, because people aren't going to be, because in some cases, because they are taking their cues from the president, they aren't going to be as willing to concede any sort of loss or concede a victory, I guess.
I think it can potentially be ugly. Because we're talking right now, we're hearing from leaders in this country to challenge the results. That how are we going to know if they're valid? We're not going to accept the results. All this kind of conversation. We have a societal upheaval going on, a revolution almost, if you will, going on in this country right now, in the middle of a pandemic. You have very strong supporters on both sides of these two candidates. They've already shown a willingness to take to the streets, both sides. And from lawsuits on down to street protests or even street violence and everything in between, none of that would surprise me at the end of this election. I don't know what it's going to be. None of us do. But I will tell you, I'm worried about when the results are announced, how this country is going to respond.
Well, and Rana, you probably remember this. I mean, we got a taste of sort of that when in the governor's election in Kentucky, there was a very pro-Trump Republican candidate who was voted out by a Democratic candidate in Kentucky, which it leans pretty right. And he asked for a recanvass almost immediately. He did not ask for a recount and didn't challenge it, but he did ask for a recanvass. So we were headed down that path pretty quickly. Before he realized that wasn't going to go in his favor. So I think that there is definitely the inkling to go to challenge, to ask for a challenge in these elections right now. I don't think that people are afraid to do that. And I think that we could definitely see that.
Well, thank you
Good
guys
question,
so much.
by the way.
Oh, sorry.
Good question.
Yeah. Well, thank you guys so much for taking part in this panel. It's been about an hour, so I think it's probably time to wrap it up. But does anybody have any closing remarks before we sign off?
Go to the polls and vote. Once. Just once.
Just once. Yeah. Go vote.
And good luck to everyone. It's going to be a long season, but y'all can
Yes,
do
it is. It already has been.
It already has.
That's what I was
Pack
gonna
your
say.
patience. Pack your patience.
Yes.
Well, yeah.
Thanks,
Well,
Ashley.
Yeah, thank you guys for joining us. This has been awesome. I think, as a political reporter myself, I think this helped me just to discuss and hear from you guys. But I'm excited about this November, but, it's going to be interesting. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah. Thank you.
Well, I hope you guys all have a good night and thanks for joining.
Thank you. Good night.
Thanks a lot.
Good night.
Bye.